for Impact the ABC TV Screenwriters Workshop. Is that something you're interested in?
Sort of, and I know someone who'd be very interested in that.
Okay.
So if you want to forward that to me, is this the problem? I thought this was the wrong setting.
I'll let you put your email address in.
Okay.
It's ready to forward, just put the address in.
Hang on a second. Sure. Assalamualaikum, Sheikh Mustafa. Should the setting be on integrated microphone array IDT, or should it be on just the one that says microphone IDT? Yeah, on the stream. Yeah. What do you mean we're not using the external microphone? We're using the little gray box. Okay. One we normally use the audio, so just I'm gonna go back into the office and make sure it sounds okay on the computer. Okay. So.
If you're having any trouble, maybe just put your email address in here, and I'll be out of your chat. How's everything going otherwise?
Good. You know, it's really funny that I can type so easily on these things. And I make so many typos on my phone.
Really? Is it a touch screen?
And it's a Droid.
See, that's what happens.
Maybe, but those buttons are so much smaller, aren't they?
Yeah, I have that syndrome.
Yeah. Look at that. There's so many typos.
I do too. I sometimes send some really interesting messages. And because we have so many Arabic words that we use without thinking, I had to take it off of auto spelling as early as that was early. Because they made up some funny words for ledger and for,
Doesn't your phone pick up the Arabic words that you use? No? It picks up mine words.
Maybe you have it saved in there or something, I don't know. Anyway, I gave up on it.
Alright, I'm just gonna go check to make sure the sound is.
You have edit on it? No. I don't read it. I don't understand it.
Like this one?
Yeah, I don't read it.
It's picking up
in English. It is coming out, but I'm supposed to be under the other settings, so now I'm like confused.
Yeah, but it's picking up from the. Is it picking up from this one?
Check this.
No, it's picking up from this speaker.
Okay.
It's still working, but.
It's working, yeah.
Integrated microphone array.
I've never used that one.
It should be the analog audio in, right? Elagato.
I thought it was the third one. Microphone, just the one that says microphone IDT codec.
One?
Yeah.
Testing. Yeah. So this is not working, but this laptop is working.
You're taking like this on,
That's only for Thursdays.
okay.
It all sounds like static.
Wait 20 seconds and let me know. Inshallah. Then we'll start as soon as
You
it's
might be getting feedback across the two.
could.
What's the last day of this class?
This is week 8, right? So 9 and 10. 2 more weeks. Sure. Oh yeah.
Our vacation, it will be March 31. We start our.
Yeah, is there a week vacation? I don't know if there's a vacation. Oh, in the school.
School, 1 week only. I don't want to spend it in studying.
I'll give you the notes in advance.
Yeah, this time, this one, the paper is harder.
Yeah, it's
Than
hard.
others.
Yeah. This is one of the most difficult classes in
Why are you
CIS.
learning it?
Why now or why we're learning it? You mean why now? Because to be honest with you, it's easier for me to prepare. You know why it's easier to prepare? This is the easiest class for me to prepare actually. Yeah. Because the most technical classes is almost the way that we learned it in school. All the other classes, I have to teach them differently, and it's not, I don't want to teach the way that we learned it. So it's figuring out how to restructure it is more difficult. So this is the easiest class for me actually. And it's the most difficult for students.
The only thing is the words you are using.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
English, you know.
Well, the Arabic, you don't have to memorize the Arabic words, you know. Just,
Yeah, but even the English, I was.
yeah, it's
in
very,
my mind,
it's technical. Yeah, it's very technical.
Translated to actually, I mean.
So we're getting a light Joseph class?
Yeah,
Light version?
No, it's not the light. This is what you'll cover in 3 semesters if you go to an Islamic university. Cram in with all the stuff that you really don't need, just kind of take it out. All the little interesting things which you never use, just take it out. So, is it working? Yeah? Okay, alhamdulillah. Good. Alright. So let's get started as soon as this goes up. Any questions before we begin? Okay. Oh, Brother Aziza, you want to try to fix this? I don't know if you know, do you know this device very well, or should we just leave it? Because it's not picking up this one into the Google feed. Or should we just skip it for now? It's picking up this microphone, the laptop microphone, but not this one. Going into the Elgato system. It looks good, huh?
No, this.
Oh, we'll leave it till break time, inshallah.
Okay, try now. So because the thing is only. You have somewhere we can monitor this, no?
You have the video connected, but I don't think the audio is connected.
Yeah, but that's what they did before this. I don't know how.
Okay, no problem. We'll figure it out later. We'll get started.
Is there any way we can monitor? No?
No, the sound is working right now, but through the laptop, not through the wireless one. It's fine.
Yeah, because it's connected here.
Yeah. Let's leave that then. If you're here during break time, you can try it, inshallah. So we'll get started, inshallah. So. Okay. It's okay, inshallah. We'll get started. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Oh yes. We need the PowerPoint, yes. Where is the PowerPoint?
Running it. Doesn't show up on the desktop. It's on the.
Yes. Okay, Sister Mina, sorry. Is the PowerPoint here?
Yeah, it's right on the bottom download.
Oh, okay, there we go. Can I have a volunteer for clicking, please? Got it? You can from your seat.
Okay.
Yes. All right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So linguistic rules. So now we're moving on to the third and final section of our class. So the first section of what we taught was, does anyone remember what the first section was about? We talked about Quran and Sunnah and Ijma', which is consensus and analogy. What are these things? Anyone know what they are? Okay. Right. So what do we generally call them? There's a word that we use in the text. Does anyone recall what it is? They're the sources. The sources and the methods of Islamic law. Right? So the Quran is the source. Right? The Sunnah is the source. Analogy is a method. Right? A method to derive Islamic law. Istihsan is a method. Juristic preference is a method. So these are methods, so we covered that. Right? And after we covered all of those different methods, we covered something else. Does anyone remember what we covered? We covered the ruling, right? The idea of the ruling. So what is a rule in Islam? Right? In terms of what is a hukum, what is a rule, who's the doer, who's the, how do you divide rulings up into different ways? So that's section number 2, basically. Now we're moving on to the last part. And actually the last part, I would say, is the most important part of this subject which we're studying, the principles of jurisprudence, and that is the linguistic rules of how to understand the language aspect, right? So when we talked about qiyas, we talked about analogy, we talked about juristic preference and all of that, we didn't go into the language of the wording of the actual text, right? We just talked about methods to look at. Now we're looking at the language of the text itself, and language is extremely important because if you don't have the language down properly, you're not going to be able to understand the text correctly. So if you look at it, our 2 main sources in Islam are what? Quran and Sunnah, right? Now, we are fortunate, and we're honored actually to have them preserved in the original language. And every Muslim, has pride in that. And other people have not even been able to preserve their religious text properly in the language. We have them preserved. Right? Even in the language itself, many people do not have it preserved. We have it preserved, and that's an amazing thing. But it's not enough only for them to be preserved. The fact that they've been preserved doesn't mean that everyone's going to understand them correctly now. There's more to it than just preservation. So there's a language element, and we said in the beginning of class that language has a natural ambiguity to it. There's naturally, language is ambiguous. So for example, if you tell somebody, I'm going to be back in a flash. You're not going to be back in a flash, right? You're not going to, I'll be back in a second. You're not really going to be back in a second. If you tell somebody, you know what, I saw Muhammad in the room. Does it mean that you only saw Muhammad, no one else was in the entire room except, are you giving the entire description? No, you're not. Right? So there's a lot of ambiguity in language. That's the way it is. That's the way it functions. It's not a closed system whenever you speak. You don't say, I saw Muhammad inside the room of the masjid at that specific address with these coordinates, and there happened to be nobody else inside that room, at least not any human beings. You don't speak like that, right? Unless you're an attorney, right? Or you're a computer science major. It's working now? Let me just make sure. Test. No, it's not. It's working through the microphone still. It's okay, don't worry about it. As long as this thing is going, it's fine. Alright. So, unless you're an attorney or you're doing computer language. You don't speak like that, right? You don't have to be that precise and that accurate. So there's natural ambiguity in the Quran and the Sunnah come in that natural language, so there's going to be some ambiguity. Now, to add to that further, the Quran and Sunnah have been preserved in their, well, obviously in their oral form, but also in the written form, in the sense that we don't have access to the recordings of the original Prophet, peace be upon him, speaking with video. Right? We don't have video recordings of him speaking. So what does that mean? So when you listen to a lecture in audio and you watch a lecture with video, do you see a difference? Which one has more, which one is clearer to understand the meaning? Video. Why? What is one of the reasons? Outside of, let's say you don't have any attention problems at all. You can focus just as well on the audio as you can with the video. Is the video still better? Why is the video better?
Facial expressions of the person.
You can see the facial expressions of the person. You can, you can kind of get a feel for what, what they're feeling when they're conveying something. Now, you compare audio with somebody else quoting exactly what the speaker said. Which one is going to be more accurate? The audio of the speaker speaking first. But what's the reason for it?
You hear the intonations in their voice.
Exactly. The intonations and the tone of their voice and the way they're speaking, the person cannot imitate that exactly. It's not going to be the, even if they try it, it's not going to be the exact same thing. So there's a little bit loss of the style in which it was addressed, even though the wording is there clearly. Right? So that's what we have in the Quran and Sunnah, because we couldn't have every single companion imitate exactly the tone and the style and the hand gesture 100% the way that the Prophet said it, or even the Quran, right? So you have that, right? And that means that you want to understand the text in the way that they were originally intended. You want to know exactly what did Allah intend when He revealed this verse. You want to know what exactly did the Prophet mean when he said this prophetic statement. You want to know the details. But you're lacking, you can't see their tone of voice. You can't see the facial expression. You can read about it a little bit, but it's not the same as seeing it. So you have to utilize, what can you utilize? The only thing you can really utilize is the language itself, to try to understand what the person really meant. Right? That's the tools that we have. So if we take the Arabic language, like any other language, you look at how the language has been utilized by people who use the language. Language is always defined by people who are using the language at a certain period of time, right? So that's where grammar comes from. So grammar is derived, the rules that have been derived based upon the way that people have been using the language. So it's like the chicken or the egg argument. Which one comes first? So which one comes first? Grammar or language? Always language. See, yeah. Grammar doesn't exist before language. People start speaking a certain way, and then they look and say, well, how are they speaking? And then they figure out, oh, they speak like this. They wouldn't say this, but they say this. So then you start putting down grammar rules. Like Ebonics, for example. Ebonics is like a street language in America. They started making grammar rules for it. So when you say, like, I don't know, what's up or something like that, if you don't pronounce the Z properly and you throw in a C sound, it's not correct. You didn't say the what's up properly or whatever it may be, right? So the thing is, the language comes first. So the thing is, should we use rules, grammatical rules, to try to understand the Quran? Yes, we should. Because as long as those grammar rules were derived from the analysis of the language which was already being used at the time of the Prophet and at the time the Quran was being revealed. And we can go ahead and see that. So we can utilize language to understand. That's one thing. And this will give us a better understanding. So if somebody comes along and looks up a bunch of words in the dictionary and says, well, I think this one means this one means this, but they don't know the grammar, or they don't know how the sentence structure is supposed to mean something, they're going to fall into errors. That's in terms of sentences. Even individual words are problematic. Problematic in the sense that one word can have more than one meaning. So one individual word can actually have more than one meaning. Right? So we've seen, I gave you a few examples of this in the first class. Does anyone happen to remember one example of an Arabic word that has more than one meaning? Yes. Kafir being a disbeliever or a farmer. Exactly. Does anyone remember another word? There are some words which have completely opposite meanings. Literally the exact opposite.
My least favorite.
Your least favorite, yes, go ahead. Yeah, one is the perfect example as well.
I disagree with it.
Yes. Okay. This brother's uncomfortable with the word, but that's just the reality of Arabic. So the word dhann can actually mean conjecture, or it can mean certainty. Certainty is the opposite of conjecture. So it has the opposite meaning. Anyone know another word?
Ma is a word that has different meanings.
More of a concrete word, more concrete. Yeah. Well, okay, what it can mean male or can mean male and female in the culture, that's more on culture, that's true. So there are a lot of words anyways, like for example, I'll leave it at that. So there's a lot of words which can even have opposite meanings, and words which can have more than one meaning, right? Like the word ayn, for example. I think we learned this in the Arabic class already. Did we learn ayn or no? We learned hand, we learned nose, we learned face. We didn't learn ayn. So the word ayn, for example, means eye. The word ayn can also mean a water spring. So what is the relationship between the two? You know, you can figure that out. So you have to know which word is being intended in the context. Otherwise, you can take a dictionary and you see 3 different meanings. Say, well, I'm going to substitute this meaning, like we saw in the first day of class. Or the word could have been intended metaphorically. So if the word is intended metaphorically and you take it literally, you have a problem. And if it's intended literally and you take it metaphorically, you have a problem. So you have to know and understand what did the text actually intend in the first place. Now the reality is, this interpretation of the text is not only applied to the Quran and Sunnah. It's not only applied to ancient texts. It applies to even contemporary texts. So you can take and you can write a whole commentary on a Harry Potter series, right? Explaining, well, what did the author really mean here? Or this is a little bit ambiguous. What exactly was she trying to say? Or if you look at the U.S. Constitution, we talked about this before. Who interprets the U.S. Constitution? Judges do. And then the final decision, if everyone is disagreeing on what it really means, is going to be who? Not the jury. The Supreme Court. They're going to make the final decision at the end. So you know, all you people are wrong. All you other judges were wrong. We're the ones who are right. This is what you're going to be following. So the same thing, and this is a very, relatively modern text, and yet it requires interpretation. So let's look at textual implications. So this is a way that you look at the different shades of meaning in the actual wording in the sentences of verses of the Quran and statements of the Prophet. This is known as dalalat al-nas. Okay? Dalala is an implication or an indication. It's like a sign. And al-nas is a text. Okay? So any Islamic text can have different shades of meaning, and it's important not to neglect any of them if that's what was intended. There's a lot of things intended by one text. Okay? Some of these meanings can be very obvious. So you just read it, and you're like, okay, say, He is Allah, the One. Okay, Allah is one. That's very clear. You don't worship anyone else besides Allah. Do not take any other deities for worship besides Allah. It's clear cut. It's not difficult to understand, right? But there are some other meanings which require some detailed reflection, a little bit more analysis to figure out some of these details, right? Now, as Muslims, we're required, or we should try to understand all the possible meanings that were intended by Allah and His Messenger in these texts. Otherwise, we miss something, right? So if somebody tells you to go do something, do this task, and in their mind they were thinking that, you're going to do these 3 steps, and it's implied in the way you told them what to do, and they only figured out 2 out of 3. It's a problem. You missed one, right? And it was there in the wording. I thought you'd figure it out. So, well, you didn't explain it clearly to me. And you say, no, well, it was clear enough for you to figure out, but you just didn't figure it out. Same thing, we're trying to figure out all the possible meanings that Allah and His Messenger actually intended, what they really meant. Because one statement can have a lot of different meanings involved, and we're going to see that. So we should not try to neglect any of those things. So there's different ways of categorizing this, but one group of scholars, which we're going to follow here, they have classified these textual implications into 4 categories. The first category is the explicit meaning of the text. It's known as the ibaratun nafs. Okay? The explicit meaning of the text. So what is the explicit meaning? It's what the actual words in the text were intended to convey, and it's clear from the context that this was the intention of the text. Right? And within this, you can have a primary meaning, and you can have an incidental meaning, or a secondary meaning. So one of them, and one example will clarify all of this for you. Okay? So there's a primary meaning and there's an incidental meaning. So let's take a look at the example, so it becomes clear for you. The example is the verse about interest. So the verse about interest says, those who consume interest cannot stand on the day of resurrection except as one stands who is being beaten by Satan into insanity. That is because they say trade is just like interest, but Allah has permitted trade and has forbidden interest. Okay? So hopefully the text is clear. So Allah is talking, no, leave this example. So Allah is talking about forbidding interest. Right? And then it says, the reason why interest is going to warrant this punishment on the Day of Judgment is because people are saying, the reason why we're telling you this is because people are saying that trade, doing business, is just like interest. They're almost the same thing. So you sell an item, right? When you buy it for $5, you sell it for $6. You make $1 profit. Okay, so you have $5 cash, and you sell the $5 cash for $6. You make $1 profit. Same thing. So people are making an argument and they're saying trade is like interest. And then the response is, but Allah has permitted trade and He's forbidden interest. Right? So he said, well, one of them is allowed for you, one of them is not allowed for you. So now if you look at the meanings, there's a lot of meanings here. So among the meanings, the first explicit meaning that's there is that trade, when it's fair, and interest are 2 different things. There are 2 different things. And that's the explicit meaning, and that's the primary meaning of the text. So the main reason of saying this sentence, but Allah has permitted trade and has forbidden interest, is the primary meaning to tell you that trade is allowed and to tell you that interest is not allowed? No. That's not the primary meaning of this text. So if somebody says the primary meaning of this text is to say that interest is forbidden, that's not true. The primary meaning of this text, if you look at the whole context and the wording, is to answer this person's objection that trade is like interest, and the answer comes, no, it's not like interest. You're wrong. The 2 are different. That's the number 1 meaning that comes to mind when you read this in context. And that's an explicit meaning. Then there's the subsidiary meaning, or the incidental meaning. And the incidental meaning is that interest is forbidden and trade is allowed. And that's also clear-cut. It's explicit, but it wasn't the main context of it. It was almost said on a side note, right? So if somebody comes and asks you, hey, you know what? I don't think marijuana should be forbidden because it helps me concentrate in prayer. And you tell them, you know what? Marijuana is forbidden because it doesn't help you to actually concentrate in prayer. Now, what is my primary meaning in what I said?
Marijuana is forbidden.
No. I did not say that primary meaning. My main reason for me speaking this is not that telling you marijuana is forbidden. It's telling you not that it does not help you concentrate in prayer. It does not help your prayer achieve what it's going to be achieving. The secondary meaning, which is also explicit, it's in my wording, but the secondary meaning is I'm upholding the stance that marijuana is forbidden for you. So there's a difference between this. You have to understand the primary and there's this incidental or subsidiary. Because of the context, this person asking in a specific context, I'm responding to the context. Right? So it's important to understand the difference between them. Right? So that's a subsidiary meaning. It's incidental meaning because it's a response. Next example is about polygyny, okay, or polygamy. It says, and if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry those that please you of other women, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just to them, then marry only one. Okay. So before I tell you what meanings are here, what meanings? There's an exercise for you. How many meanings do you see in this text? What are some of the meanings? Start throwing them out, and then we'll decide where they're categorized: primary, incidental, something else. You're allowed to marry 4. So that's one meaning. You can't be fair. Okay. No, it says if you can be fair. But yeah. But it doesn't say that here, though, right? No, it's there somewhere. It's there somewhere else, but in this specific text, right? And if you fear that you're going to be unjust, yeah. They should be what?
They should be treated fairly.
They should be treated fairly. Right? So the women should be treated fairly. Right? What else?
If you can't treat them fairly, marry this one.
If you can't treat them fairly, then you only marry one. Okay. What else? Treating orphans equally or treating them fairly. Don't oppress orphans. Right? What else?
Can you marry the orphan?
So that's what it's saying, right? Yeah. So are you allowed to? So are you saying that to me, or that was a question? Oh, that was a question. Yeah. If you can't marry an orphan girl, that means orphans are stuck and they can never get married. That would be horrible. Yeah, of course you can get married.
They should be helped.
They
should be helped with money.
They should be helped through marriage. Yes, exactly.
You should only marry them if you fear you will not deal with them justly.
Right. So these are all different meanings. Right? We're seeing all these different meanings. So let's look at these. Let's analyze some of these meanings. So meaning number 1, orphan girls should be treated fairly. Where is this? Where is this in the text here?
Fear that you will not deal justly.
Yeah. And if you fear that you're not going to deal justly with the orphan girls, then do such and such. It's implied in there that you should be fair to them. And if you're not going to be fair to them, then this is what's going to happen. Now, why would somebody, just so they understand, why would somebody not be fair to an orphan girl?
That's their own kids.
But then she has no parents.
She doesn't have parents. It's not about their own kids. Those support systems, because the parents are not there, this is a caste system, other systems, but you can go and you can, misuse them. In the sense you can take advantage of them. So if you're not going to deal justly with them, then you know what? Marry someone else. Don't try and marry orphans, because we're talking about orphans specifically who the parents have left, either the parents have not left anything, so they're in a weak situation, or the parents have left them a lot of wealth, right? And they're inheriting it, and now you want to take advantage of that. It's not being split anywhere else. So you can go, orphans are in a difficult position. So you have to treat them fairly, that's meaning number 1. But what is the meaning? Is the meaning primary or incidental? About treatment of orphans.
Primary.
It's a primary meaning of the text?
No, not of the text.
Of this text.
No, it's an incidental.
It's an incidental meaning. Why? Because that's not the focus, right? The focus is not that. So it's like saying, you know what? If you can't make enough money in your business, then you still are not allowed to engage in interest. The primary meaning is you're not allowed to engage in interest. The incidental meaning is, you know what, you need to, try to make some money in your business if you can. Don't try to lose money or something like that. So it's incidental meaning, not the primary reason of the text. Another meaning is that a man is allowed to marry whom he's pleased with. Right? So you can actually select who you want to marry, right? That's another meaning that's there. So marry ones that please you, people that please you. So the thing is that marriage is allowed, marriage is lawful, and you have a kind of a decision in the process, incidental or primary meaning.
So what is the actual primary meaning?
But we're getting there, patience. So what? So is this primary incidental? Incidental meaning. Okay. Next meaning, the limit on the number of wives is 4. It's a primary meaning. The limit is 4, primary meaning. Okay. If you can't deal with them fairly, then you only marry one. Primary or incidental? It's also primary. It's also primary. Right? It's explicit. They're all explicit in the fact that they're there in the wording, and the intention is there, but it's not the main reason for the text. So there's 2 primary meanings, and there's 2 incidental meanings. Okay, and sometimes there can be a gray area between some of them. Maybe look like primary, maybe look like incidental. You don't need to lose any hair over this.
They used to marry more than 4, that's why they did it.
Yes, that's right. They used to marry more than 4, and this limitation is there. Even in the wording, in the context and everything, one of the primary meanings is limiting. Limiting to 4, and limiting to 1. So 2 limits are being set, and that's the primary purpose behind it, right?
So, just a little bit confusing, please. So, are you supposed to marry the orphan girls that you cannot treat justly, or you just go ahead and marry somebody that you cannot treat orphan justly?
So, by the end of the class, we're going to cover that, because that's the next chapter. That's the next chapter. We're going to cover that today, inshallah. Okay? So, this is known as the inverse meaning. Do you assume the opposite or not? So we're going to talk about that, okay? So it's important to understand that this explicit meaning that we're talking about, most of the Islamic texts, meaning Quran and Sunnah, most of the wordings of the things, like when it talks about praying, it talks about fasting, it talks about zakah, it talks about inheritance, it talks about penalties and all of that, they're established through explicit meanings. So all the main things in Islam are usually established by explicit meaning, so no one can get the wrong idea. So it's clear cut when you're talking about a lot of these things. So they're usually going to be explicit. Then we have the second part of the text, known as the alluded meaning. So the alluded meaning, waiting for you.
So we still don't know what the primary meaning of that sentence was.
Yeah.
You had 2.
Yeah, 2.
But primary is 1.
No. Primary means the most important, right?
Okay, so the most important is 2?
Yeah. Because it's a long text. So one part of the text has this primary meaning.
Each part
has a primary meaning.
2 questions.
Yeah. So well, there's a lot. You could derive about 6 meanings from that text.
Yeah.
2 of them would be primary, maybe 3. Maybe there's a 3rd one, but the rest of them are incidental.
Okay, but primary normally means 1.
So not in this case. Primary means the first and the most important.
Primary is 1.
If the text was lit, so we're looking at the whole verse. If you look at just a part of it, then there's only going to be 1 meaning. So we take the whole verse. So the verse is long, so you can have more than 1.
Because that was confusing in some of the tests where it asked for a primary reason,
Mm.
and then the answer was A and B, which is not primary anymore.
So we're trying not to take primary metaphorically.
Well, let's take it metaphorically. That's the biggest point.
You can send me an email on that. We can discuss it, inshallah.
Forgive me to continue just 1 more second.
Let's leave it really offline, inshallah.
Well,
Let's leave it
but it's
offline.
important for everyone.
Anyone has an issue, email me, inshallah, and I guarantee I will respond. Have I not responded to anyone's email? Okay. If you check my Facebook post, one guy called me just recently, yesterday. He said, you know what? I sent you an email and you didn't respond. This never happens to me. What did I do wrong? What happened? So when did you send the email? No, I must have I slipped my mind. He said, I sent an hour ago. You never responded to me. I said, okay. I said, brother, I don't check my email every hour. I'm sorry. Sure. So yeah, the next meaning is the alluded meaning, what's known as the ishara al-nas. Okay. The alluded meaning refers to something which is not understood directly from the wording of the text. It's not from the wording of the text, nor is it the original intended meaning of the text, but it's this inference you make by looking at some of the signs and the wordings in the text. So it wasn't intended to have that meaning, but it has a legitimate meaning nonetheless. Okay? So it's important that you have to understand, if you want to take the alluded meaning of a text, you have to really reflect very carefully. You have to really think about it. It requires a lot of thought to extract this meaning. Kind of like extracting a what? An illah, right? Extracting an illah. So same thing, it requires a lot of reflection, but you should be careful not to exaggerate. Otherwise you get these far-fetched meanings of text, And it says, Allah told Musa, throw down your staff. And the staff represented anger. And when he threw it down, represented that he was getting rid of his anger and he was going to be a peaceful person. That's taking it a little bit too far. Right, so some people have made tafsir like that. That's nice and it's interesting and it's a good lesson, but it's a little bit far from the text. So let's look at some examples. Example number 1 is, there is no blame upon you if you divorce women you have not touched, nor specified for them a dowry. So it says, there's no blame on you, and whenever we see there's no blame on you, do we remember what category it usually falls into? Yeah. Usually it's permitted, but it can also be above that. So permitted or something higher. Right? Because people were assuming that it might have been prohibited. That's why the wording came in this fashion. Yeah. So this is actually a good question. On the previous one, I'll answer it before I forget. So in order to find out whether a meaning is implicit or primary, you have to have a good knowledge of the context of the situation and the issue of the verse and everything. And that's actually true. That's a very good point. Okay, so going back to this. So the explicit meaning of this verse is what? What do you see the explicit meaning being? Someone who did not read the notes.
You can divorce them.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're allowed to divorce them, even if you didn't do one of these things. So even if you didn't touch them, you're allowed to divorce them. Even if you didn't specify a dowry, you're allowed to divorce them. That's pretty much what it says. It's not haram for you. Right? Now, if you look at the other way of looking at this, there's another thing. And the alluded meaning kind of builds upon the other meaning, and that is that a marriage contract is valid without specifying what the dowry is. The alluded meaning. So a marriage contract is, so everyone, we studied last class, right? Do you have to have a dowry or not?
Yes.
Absolutely?
Yeah.
Absolutely. No difference in opinion. It's clear cut, right? Okay, so that's clear cut. So now the question is, if somebody got married and they didn't discuss dowry, and they totally forgot, it slipped their mind, or whatever happened, is their marriage valid or it's not valid? Right. So that's the question. Right. Yeah?
It's valid, but it's not still
Okay, it's valid. So sister is saying it's valid, but she's still entitled to the dowry. Does anyone disagree that, you know what, hey, if you missed it, you missed it?
Yeah, but what dowry? What is the dowry going to be?
Yeah, so you have to figure out what the dowry is going to be. So anyone remember from the last class what it was? What is the dowry going to be? Huh?
It's like a debt on the land.
It's right, but it was not specified. So now she says, you know what, I want 10,000. I'm not giving you 10,000. Then what? He has to? So then the best thing is for her to distract him, get married, and then ask for like $500,000. That's a good tactic, but that's not the way it works. So what is it going to be?
In the case when it's not cash, then it would be returned.
Return? Yeah, that's getting divorced. But if they want to stay married, They stay married and they didn't specify a dowry. Did we cover this in the previous class? I think we might have addressed this issue. It's the custom. Yeah, you go by custom. So whatever is customary for women of that area, that stature, I think we talked about that. If your sister got this much and all that, so exactly, it's close to custom. It was a question on the quiz. There you go. So it was a question. So the thing is, if somebody studied the previous class and they studied that dowry is a requirement of marriage, you have to have a dowry. Someone may be inclined to think that if someone comes to you and says, we got married but we forgot to specify the dowry, they may think that the marriage is not valid. Right? I just had this case literally last week. Somebody, I don't know who, I mean, supposedly it's, I don't think there's any difference of opinion on this, but supposedly there's some scholar who, they don't want to tell us who it is, said that, no, what we studied in school was, you have to have a dowry, and if you didn't do a dowry, your marriage is not valid. This is a big problem. So the thing is, there's a difference between, so we've seen this already, we saw it in the previous 2 classes or something like that. There's a difference between an invalid act, right, and a prohibited act, right? So the difference between something that's invalid and something that's prohibited is the prohibited thing is sin against you. But if it's valid, it can be valid and prohibited. Valid in the sense that you still are married, in the sense that you don't have to repeat your prayer, in the sense that your fasting is still valid. So if you're fasting in Ramadan, okay, and you start cursing, prohibited or not prohibited? Prohibited. Do you have to repeat your fast? No, you don't. Because it's a valid, right? The fast is still valid because you didn't eat or drink. But if you cursed, you lost your temper, you've nullified probably most of the reward of your fast, if not all of it. But you don't have to repeat it. So the difference between valid and prohibited. Right? So we saw that kind of in the last class. Same thing here. So now we learned this principle. So from the alluded meaning, we're understanding that a marriage is valid even if no dowry has been specified. Right? But that doesn't mean that she's not entitled to the dowry. It means you just figure it out through custom, what's customary, and if her custom is really high, too bad for the guy. And if the custom is very low, too bad for the girl. You should have thought about that before you did the marriage contract. Right? But the marriage itself is valid. So that's known through an allusion or an alluded meaning of the text. It's not directly specified. It doesn't say marriages are valid even if the dowry is not present, but the dowry should be or has to be given to her no matter what. The text didn't say that. That's what Islamic books of law say. They use that kind of wording to explain to you what the text was actually saying. So they've taken the alluded meaning and the explicit meaning, combine them two together, and they give you this book, Islamic law book. That's why we study Islamic law as a separate subject, because the Quran doesn't talk about it like that. Right? So instead of you having to figure out the details of the alluded meaning and try to figure out what it is, it's already been done for you and it's presented for you. So if somebody says, well, I don't need to take Islamic law class. I read the Quran every day, so I see it directly. Well, you know what? Either you can't see all the alluded meanings, or it's too much effort for you. Right? It takes a lot of time and a lot of thought regarding it. You don't want to mess that up.
What is the difference in people's opinion and alluded meanings?
We're going to see that too. Inshallah, we're going to see that. So next example. For the poor immigrants, muhajirin, the people who traveled, migrated, for the poor immigrants who were expelled from their homes, where was this? In Mecca. They were expelled from Mecca. And they went to Medina. And their properties, seeking bounty from Allah and His approval and supporting Allah and His Messenger, there is also a share. So this is connected to a previous verse which I didn't put for you, so I just gave it to you in brackets. It's talking about distribution of the war booty, the spoils of war, basically. So those are the truthful. So Allah is saying in this verse that even the poor people who were kicked out of their homes in Mecca, the ones who had to migrate, they're also going to get I have no idea what just happened. 1 second. Make sure. No? Connection's still good? No, I mean the internet connection still. It should be loading up.
minutes will be in
No, it's not. It's, yeah, you're right. It's probably tired. That's what it is. It needs a coffee break. It's coming up soon, inshallah. All right. Yeah. So, let's see. We can take the alluded meaning of what it's trying to tell us. Right? So, so the people who are expelled from their homes, they're also going to get a share. Right? So now the explicit meaning is what? Those poor people who left Makkah, they get a share. They get some of the money. That's the explicit meaning. So what is the alluded meaning? So there's so many alluded meanings. One of the alluded meanings here is that, you know what? Their property is gone. See, when they left Makkah and they went to Medina, they were hoping that, you know what? Maybe our property is not gone. One day we're going to go back to Makkah. We're going to get our houses very soon. We're going to, recover our land and everything. And basically, the verse is hinting at we've been expelled from their homes and their properties. Your property is gone. So just forget the idea that you still have property back home. Technically, you're a poor person now because you lost all your property. So you need some help, and don't worry, we're going to give you some of the money from these spoils of war as well to help take care of you. So the alluded meaning is that your property is gone. Now that's not what the text is saying. The text is not really saying that your property is gone. Forget about it or something like that. But you can sense it in there. It's kind of built in there. So that's one of the signs you can take from that. Okay? So that's known as the alluded meaning, or isharat al-nas. The ishara. The implied meaning is a third level, and this is known as dalalat al-nas. Dalalat al-nas, the implied meaning. This refers to the meaning that is understood from the spirit and the rationale of the text. They say the spirit of the law.
Aren't all of these called the dalalat al-nas that you have the heading up there?
They are known as. Is it dalalat al-nas? No, it's dalalat. It should be dalalat al-nas. So, my mistake.
Let's say dalalat.
It's dalalat with the a.
Yeah.
No. Should have a line on top of the A. So the line is missing there. Right? Yeah, I mean it's the same word, but this means it's plural. So
that one has a line and this one has a line too.
No, there should be two lines on the first one. Two lines on the first one. Alright? So this is don't worry. On the title of the chapter, forget that wording, textual implication. Focus on this one. The dalalat al-nas is important. Okay? And I'll give you two different meanings for it. So in case you forget this one, you're confused, I'll give you two different words to memorize. Okay? So the implied meaning of dalalat al-nas is what you understand from the spirit and the rationale of the text. They say there's the wording of the law, there's the word of the law, and there's the spirit of the law. So this gives you the spirit of the law, but it's not indicated in the words at all. It's not there, but it's like a complementary meaning. And you have to be able to understand this. So this is it's basic logic and rationale that this has to mean this, right? And it's the legal part of something. So if I tell you, for example, look, if I tell you, I'm thinking of something. If I tell you, look, I'm thirsty, right? Can you get me something to drink, right? And you bring gutter water, right, from the sewer. Do you fulfill my request? Yes. No, because I'm not gonna drink that. He said, if you bring me urine, all right? He said, hey, you wanted something to drink? There you go. He said, but you didn't tell me what. You didn't tell me. You didn't specify that you wanted something nourishing for your body that you wanted to drink. You said you wanted something to drink. So from the literal meaning of your word, you can drink this. It's not a solid, right? It's not food, so you can actually drink this. I'm not going to drink it. So you can tell from the spirit of what I'm saying, the rationale for what I'm asking you, I want something nourishing and somewhat decently tasty, to drink. Right? So you bring something that you can actually drink. So that's what we're talking about. If someone goes, it's the logical aspect of looking at the text. Alright? Now the difference between this and analogy I'll explain later. But this is almost like using an analogy. You figure out, well, what did the person really intend, and how can I apply this to another example? So if I say I would like something to drink, you try and figure out, okay, what is kind of the illah, what are they really looking for? He's looking for something that's nourishing, something that doesn't taste so bad. So let me look at what I can apply. Will urine apply? No, it won't apply because it doesn't match. Will gutter water apply? No, it won't. Will regular water apply? Yes. Will tea apply? Yes. Will coffee apply? Yes. All of these things can apply, but these won't apply. You understand that from the spirit, but you don't need to look at illah, look at all the details and all of that. So let's look at an example. This is the best example. If you remember this example, it's the easiest example to remember. So Allah says in the Quran, your Lord has decreed that you worship none but Him alone and treat parents with the best of kindness. And you just cut off the rest of the verse. There was not enough space on the side. Okay, so most of us know this verse. The rest of it says, or should one of them or both of them attain old age in your lifetime, do not say oof to them. Do not say ugh or something like that to them, because that's a way of like complaining. And do not push them away, and always address them in nice words. Right? So the verse about saying oof to your parents, right? The wording that's there in the actual wording, explicit wording, is that it's prohibited to, say words of harm to your parents by saying oof. That's the explicit meaning. Don't say a sign like oof to your parents. So, can you curse your parents?
No.
It doesn't say that though. It says don't say oof to them. Can you curse them? No. You say, okay, I'm not going to be such a big literalist. So I'm understanding that this is saying do not use any verbal, abuse to your parents. Right? That's pretty much what it means, right? Don't abuse your parents in any way verbally. So if someone says, okay, but I'm going to physically abuse them. Or give, no, but that's verbal. That's kind of like almost verbal again, right? Implied. But let's say you say, oh, I'm going to abuse them. Someone says, well, don't show me in the Quran where it says that you can't hit your parents. But that you can't do this or you can't do it. If you're not allowed to say verbally something so small like this to them, which would annoy them, then how can you do something greater and worse than that? Right? That's this dalalat nas. That's what it's talking about. So this is known as a superior analogy. Qiyas and awla. I mean, if you're not allowed to do this, how in the world can you possibly do this? Right? There's no way that this text not only forbids you to do this, it forbids anything greater than this. It's the minimum line. Right? Anything above, you cannot hit them, you cannot kill them, you cannot do anything else to them. It's above even speaking. And it's quite obvious from the text. There's no way, but you can imagine somebody saying, well, it doesn't say that. Right? So the thing is, this is one way of understanding the text. Superior analogy. Okay. The other example is, it says, the next one. Okay. Indeed, those who devour the property of orphans unjustly are only consuming into their bellies fire, and they will be burned in a blaze. Right. So orphans who have inherited money from their parents and they're still young, and somebody says, I will be the guardian over this orphan, I will, take them in my house, and I will help them and take care of them. And you say, but I need to use some of the money that your parents left you to spend on you. And while you're spending it on them, so you would like wouldn't you like a brand new iMac, in the home for you to use? It's like a little 5-year-old, right? He says, yeah, I would like this. Okay, good. We're gonna go and get the top of the line iMac. And you're using it yourself. You really bought it for yourself, right? Wouldn't you like a brand new iPhone, the brand new model that came out? I would like that. You know what? I'm gonna get you one. And then you get it for them and you say, you don't really seem to be using all the features, so let me use it for you and I'll help you somehow. It'll help me organize my schedule to give you more time. You keep on using their money somehow, and you're wasting an orphan's money who's they've left it. So you're devouring their money unjustly. You're devouring their property unjustly. So what does it say? You're consuming fire into your belly. Now, if somebody comes along and says, okay, well, that's what the text says, yeah, but we're not allowed to steal their property or something like that. But what if I let my friend steal their property? It's not me stealing it, it's somebody else who's stealing, right? It's not my issue. That's also obviously going to be prohibited because the essence of the text is what? Protecting the property of the orphan and not letting it be taken in any just means. It's not just about you, right? So if somebody comes along and says, well, you know what? How about if I burn their property? You can't burn their property. You can't let someone else take their property. You can't gamble with their property. Well, I'm trying to make them more. So if we strike the jackpot, if we do this good, we got it, man. You know. And if you don't, then what? We're gonna split 50-50, right? If we win, you can't do that. So this is known as an equivalent analogy. It's not superior because if you take their property and you steal it, you're devouring their property. If you burn their property, you're also devouring their property in a sense. If you let somebody else do it, you're also devouring their property. So it's along the same lines rather than being of a greater nature. This is known as an equivalent analogy. It's known as qiyas and musawi. Right? So the way this works is, any example you see in an Islamic text coming along and saying this is the ruling, you don't ever restrict it to this one example. You take any other example, any scenario that you can think of, and you say, do these two apply along the same lines? Okay? That's what you're doing. So this implied meaning is sometimes known as the harmonious meaning, mafhum al-muwafaqa. You don't need to know all the terms, by the way. Mafhum al-muwafaqa, because it supplements the other meanings which are in line with the intention of the text. Right? It's also known as fahwa al-khitab, which means this is the underlying import of the speech. This is what it really meant to say in the first place. Okay? Now, if you ask me, say, you know what, that almost looks like qiyas that we already studied. It's very similar to qiyas, but there's a difference. The difference between this is a linguistic analogy rather than a rational analogy. So the difference between the two is that this one is so clear and obvious, you don't need to reflect and think about what is the effective cause. It's just clear cut. You can't hate your parents if the text says you can't even say oof to them. It's clear cut. You can't go and gamble their property away or let somebody else do it. It's clear cut. You already need to think, well, what is the effective cause and what is this? And you don't need to identify and see, now, does this one match this one? It's just so obvious. So that's the difference between the two of them. Okay. So this is the harmonious meaning or the underlying import of the speech or the implied meaning. Okay. Then we have what's known as the required meaning. This is number 4. So number 4, still looking for number 4? There we go. Number 4, required, sorry, what did you say? What's that? Yeah, if he stays at this pace, no, sorry, speed it up. So
I don't realize what's following there.
Okay, no, that's fine. So the required meaning, iqtida an-nas. Okay? This is a meaning that's required. So what you do is basically, this requires you to supplement certain words which are not mentioned in the text specifically. Right? And they have to be there in order to complete the meaning of the text. Because the literal meaning, without that supplementary meaning, it's not really going to make sense or it's not going to convey the properly intended meaning. So let's take one example. This example is a good example. So it says, prohibited to you are your mothers, your daughters, your sisters, your father's sisters, your mother's sisters, your brother's daughters, your sister's daughters, your milk mothers who nursed you, your sisters who nursed you, your wife's mothers, your stepdaughters under your guardianship, born unto your wife, unto whom you have gone in. Okay, so all of these people are prohibited to you. The question is, it says that they're haram for you, they're prohibited to you. So what is prohibited? Speaking to them is prohibited, looking at them is prohibited, being in the same room with them is prohibited. But it didn't say marrying. No, but I know, that's in the text. So, but it has to, that's actually not there in the Quran. The for marriage is not there in the Quran. And that's in the tafsir, in the translation. So it just says prohibited to. So if somebody comes along and says, well, it doesn't say, my mother is prohibited to me, I'm not allowed to be in the same room. What if it means that I cannot see her without hijab on? Someone misreads the text. This has to be there from the general context and all the other indications which indicate this. It has to be marriage. And this is important because if you want to understand the Quran properly, or you want to understand any Islamic text properly, you need to fill in these things. And if you don't fill them in properly, because you don't have this general understanding of Islam, then you're gonna misunderstand the verse entirely. Because you could add anything, prohibited something, prohibited to talk to them, prohibited to look at them, prohibited to listen to them, prohibited to whatever. It could mean anything else, but it has to be marriage. And we know, or most of us understand, it has to be marriage, and there's a long reason why. But if it was anything other than marriage, there would be a huge problem. Right? So it's something you have to understand. Now, one of the things is that, before you move on, one of the things on this is that a lot of people, this is a kind of side reflection, but it's an important reflection. A lot of people, they return back to Islam, right, after seeing that so many people have kind of taught them Islam wrong. Especially people who grew up in Islam, they've taught that, you know what, these people said this, and this cultural thing overrides this, and they learn Islam in a wrong way. Anyone, even if it could be a new Muslim. Someone learned Islam in a wrong way, and then they come back to Islam, they become very suspicious of anyone else telling them what the meaning is. So there becomes this trend that says, you know what, I don't want you to tell me things. I'm going to try to figure it out on my own because I don't have confidence and trust in what you're telling me. So it's very common for people to say, you know what, I want a word-for-word translation of the Quran without these extra parentheses and brackets or anything. I don't want that. That's something that someone else has added. I don't even want to read that because I don't accept your interpretation. I want to look at what Allah has said 100%. If Allah mentioned the word, that's what I want to read. I don't want to read your word. So they're going to take out all these brackets and parentheses and everything from the text. And I'm telling you from experience because I went through a phase like this in my life as well. And I've met many people who've done it. Anyone here happen to be or went through that? It's similar, right? Yeah. Some people have similar thoughts. So the thing is, if we understand that there's iqtida nas, there's a required meaning that you have to infer into these things, and they're there to let you explain it, and you can't understand it without it. If you try to understand it without it and you don't know the language, you don't know the context, you haven't studied all the other texts of Islam, you're going to be really going down on the wrong path. You're really, really going to get confused, and you're going to see that in this one, you know, no one's really going to come up and say you can't talk to your mother or something. But if you look at the other texts, you can see how dangerous it can be. Okay, so let's look at some of the other texts. So the next example, prohibited to you are dead animals, blood, the flesh of swine, and that which has been dedicated to other than Allah, and the animals killed by strangling, or by a violent blow, or by a headlong fall, or by goring of the horns, and those from which a wild animal has eaten, except what you're able to slaughter before its death, and the rest of the verse. Right? So it's a long verse. Now, what is this verse? This verse is clearly forbidding these things, right? It says forbidden, prohibited to you. Same wording. Now the question is, you look at what's prohibited. All these animals, you know, what do we have? Dead animals, blood, flesh of swine, right? So let's look at blood, for example. Okay, let's take a look at blood. So what does it mean that it's forbidden for you? What is forbidden?
You can't drink blood. You can't combine blood.
You can't eat it. You can't drink it. In terms of blood, right? You cannot sip it. You cannot take it or something like that. You're not supposed to be taking any of these things. So clearly it specifies that that's the reason. But what if someone says, well, maybe it also means touching it? Are you allowed to touch blood?
Yeah.
What if this verse prohibits even touching it? You're not allowed to eat it. You're not allowed to touch it.
It doesn't say that.
It doesn't say that you can't eat either. Right? So what does the prohibition entail? Maybe smelling at it is prohibited. Maybe looking at it is prohibited. In addition to eating it, in addition to consuming it. So you have to understand and look at what is it specifically saying, and you have to be able to fill in the prohibited to you part. if you fill it in wrong, you get a wrong meaning. If you fill it in right, you get the right meaning. Okay? So it's very important that you understand that text. So obviously this refers to eating, right, and consuming. But if it's filled in wrong, the whole thing's going to be wrong. Let's take a different example. Another example can be very dangerous. None of you has faith until he desires for his brother what he wants for himself. It's hadith. This is the prophetic statement. Right? So now, none of you has faith. So if you find a person who's very selfish and they want something for themselves, and say, well, don't you want it for your brother? Say, no. Oh, this person just left Islam. Right? It's time to make an appointment with the office and take your shahada again. Right? Or you know what? This person is unbeliever, and all of a sudden the guy has a heart attack right there and he dies. We will not bury him as a Muslim because he just did something. The Prophet said he does not have faith, and he clearly stated that he doesn't want nothing for his brother. Can't bury him in the Muslim graveyard. Go give him to the other graveyard. Put him in a coffin, whatever you want to do, cremate him or something. This can't mean this, right? So there has to be a required meaning. So what is the required meaning here? None of you has complete faith or true faith, right? There has to be implied in there. How do you know it? There's a way of knowing, right? But you understand the importance of importance of filling this in. Another example. Now this is a good example to help you. So there is no fast for anyone who has not intended it from the night before. There is no fast. Right? So the fast isn't there, right? For the one who didn't intend the fast from the night before. You didn't have the proper intention when you were about to start the fast in Ramadan. In that case, what happens? Right? So here, you actually have a difference of opinion among the scholars as to what the necessary meaning of the iqtida an-nas is. So if you look at the Hanafi school said that there is no fast means there is no complete fast. So if you fast without the intention there, it's incomplete, meaning the reward is not complete. But you don't need to repeat the fast again. The Shafi'i school said that the fast is invalid, meaning there is no fast, meaning the fast doesn't count at all. It's an invalid fast, you have to repeat the fast again. So the way that they filled it, sometimes you can see a difference of opinion on how you're supposed to fill in the necessary meaning of the text. But you see the importance of it, right? So to summarize, let's look at a chart real quick. And see if is the chart here. Yes, it is. Okay. So this will help you. I just threw this in there, maybe to help you understand. So the explicit meaning, it's from the wording, and it's from the essential meaning with the intention of the text, right? And the method that you figure it out is by looking at the wording itself. Okay? The alluded meaning is from the wording of the text, right? But it's not the essential meaning really of the text. It's not the real purpose. So how do you figure it out? You figure it out from the signs that are there in the text. The implied meaning is not from the wording, but it's from the purpose, or the essential meaning of what the text was trying to say, but it's not mentioned at all in there. That's inference. So you use inference to figure it out. And the required meaning, it's not from the wording, right? But the essential meaning tells you how to fill in that wording. It's basically a missing element of the text.
I have a question regarding that fasting verse that you put there. So from the night before means after Maghrib tonight, I have to make a niyyah for fasting tomorrow, or
from the night means before dawn.
Before dawn.
Okay. Let's see, we still got a few minutes. So 9 o'clock is Isha, so we still have a few minutes, then we'll break. We'll break at 8:50. So somebody remind me, 8:50 we break. So the priorities. So there are priorities of textual implications. So sometimes you can have a conflict between two different meanings in the same text. So there's an explicit meaning in one text and an alluded meaning in another text. And both of them are contradictory. Right? The explicit meaning in one text and the explicit meaning in another text, you're never going to find a contradiction. Because that's a real contradiction. You should not be finding any of those. It means something went wrong in your understanding. But if you have an explicit meaning and an alluded meaning and they're contradicting each other, this can happen. It can potentially happen. So what do you do in this case? Which meaning do you take? You go with the priority. So the priority is the order that I gave you. So number 1 is explicit, number 2 is alluded, number 3 is implied meaning. And what is number 4? No. Because the required meaning has nothing to do with the actual detail, so it can't really override one thing or the other. Right? So you only need to worry about these 3 things. The explicit, the alluded, and the implied, the first 3 that we looked at in that order. So how does it work? The explicit meaning overrides the alluded meaning and it overrides the implied meaning. Why? Because that was the original intent of the text, and it was the main purpose of the text, and it's mentioned in the text. The explicit meaning is the strongest meaning that you can find. Then you have the alluded meaning. And the alluded meaning will override the implied meaning. Question is why? Why should the alluded meaning override the implied meaning? Because the alluded meaning is something which is there in the text, but you took it from looking at a sign or something like that, whereas the implied meaning is derived through type of analogy or human rationality was played a role. So now there's this debate. Do we take this one over this one or this one over this one? Right? So in this case, the school that we're taking, there's difference of opinion here, but the school that we're taking is we take the text over this one because you're still using rationality to derive this, but it's mentioned in the text. You're using rationality here, but it's not mentioned in the text. So if you're using human rationality in Go, it's safer and better to go with what's mentioned in the text explicitly. Otherwise, you can go and really mess this up completely. So this should be overriding this. Okay, and there's another school that says, no, this one should be overriding this one. And the irony of it is that the school that says the alluded meaning overrides the implied meaning, the one that we're taking, they're actually more of a rational school, and the other school is more closer to being a literal school. Yet on this issue, they flipped around. And there's a reason why it's happening. Okay? So we're not going to go into the reason. So let's look at some examples. Okay. Example is, but whoever kills this is a verse from the Quran. Whoever kills a believer intentionally, his recompense will be hell, where he will abide eternally, and Allah has become angry with him, and has cursed him, and has prepared for him a great punishment. So if you kill a believer intentionally, this is the worst thing that can happen to you, right? So the explicit meaning we can understand. What is the alluded meaning? Alluded meaning of this verse might suggest that, you know what? Somebody goes and kills somebody. And they say, well, what's going to happen to me? And you tell them, what's going to happen to you? Allah is going to be angry with you. Your abode is going to be hell. It's going to be this, unless you're repenting. If you do something like this, this is what's going to happen to you. And somebody asks you, I'm thinking about killing this person. What's going to happen to me? And you say, you know what? What's going to happen to you is, look at what the verse says. This is what's going to happen to you. So the alluded meaning is, this is the penalty. This is what's going to happen to you. Right? But there's another verse in the Quran. And the other verse in the Quran says, let's look at it. Oh, it's not there. That's fine. Leave it. It says, O you who have believed, prescribed for you is legal retribution for those who have been murdered. It's not qisas. So there is retribution for someone who's been murdered. So you go and you kill somebody else, you can potentially have this prescription of retaliation on you, you get killed. Right? Now, the first verse didn't mention that. It talked about killing, but it didn't mention this part. So now the guy who asked you, you told him the verse, and if he says, oh, I don't care, I'm going to make tawbah later, I'll ask Allah for forgiveness later. You didn't tell him this part. And this is in another verse. Now, this verse here, is it explicit or alluded when it says that there will be retribution, meaning the death penalty? What is it? It's clear cut. It's explicit. Right? It's totally explicit. So now, this meaning contradicts the alluded meaning that we were looking at before, which says that the punishment, because Allah mentioned in that whole verse, if you kill somebody intentionally, kill a Muslim intentionally, you know what you get? You get hell, and Allah will be angry with you, and this will happen. You say, oh, well, that's the limit. That's the extent of what's going to happen. That's bad enough. But it didn't say anything else about this me being killed. So now this is an explicit meaning, and this is an alluded meaning. And the two of them are contradicting. So one of them has to override the other. Either you only get this, or you get this on top of that, if you don't repent. So what happens? The explicit meaning overrides the alluded meaning, and you say it's not the alluded meaning that you were looking at was not derived 100% correctly. So it's not limited to only Allah being angry with you and only that you're gonna suffer in hellfire if you don't repent or something. You're also gonna get retaliation against you. Okay? Assalamu alaikum. Can you do it without the microphone, please? Just leave the microphone off and just do it.
Eternally. How it says even if the believer is in hell.
Yes.
Eternally,
Yes.
although we learn you can only be in hell eternally.
Yes. We'll leave that for another discussion. Yeah. So.
And then the person who is killing the other person as qisas is also not under the edicts of this verse as well, right? So if there's somebody who is ordained to kill somebody because they had murdered somebody else who was a believer, then that person will not have the same penalty.
That's true. That's true nonetheless, and that's necessary meaning. So, so now the question is, so how does it work? So the explicit meaning overrides the alluded meaning in this case. So there will be qisas, there will be retaliation, and it's not restricted by the other one. This is one example. Is this example clear? Okay. So next example is, Allah says, and never think of those who have been killed in the cause of Allah as dead, meaning martyrs. Rather, they are alive with their Lord and they're receiving provision from Allah. So don't think that people who've been martyred in the path of Allah, they were fighting and they've been killed. Don't look at them as dead. They're not dead. In fact, they're alive. It says specifically, they're alive with Allah and they're actually receiving provision. They're getting fruits, they're being fed, they're enjoying themselves. So what is the alluded meaning here? The explicit meaning is clear. That, you know what? Don't be sad over the state of people who've been killed in the path of Allah. There's no need to be sad for them. They're fine. You're stressing out that they died. They're getting the reward from Allah. Don't worry about that. But the alluded meaning here might be that, you know what? If the martyrs are alive, Allah says they're alive, right? So that means they don't get a funeral prayer. Because the funeral prayer only applies to people who are dead, right? And their inheritance is not going to be distributed to their heirs, because you only distribute inheritance when someone is dead. And if they're not dead, Allah says they're alive, you don't distribute their inheritance. So that can be an alluded meaning that someone can derive from some of the signs here. But it's clear cut that the Prophet, peace be upon him, he made it clear that even martyrs who are killed, or anyone else who is killed, they're supposed to be prayed over. So, and in an explicit text, I didn't put the text here, but it's an explicit text. So the explicit text will override the alluded meaning. And likewise, distribution of property. Right? So it means that all of these things will be established in a way that overrides the explicit meaning, overrides the alluded meaning. That's going to be distributed anyways. Okay. Last example, and then we'll break. And whoever kills a believer by mistake, not intentionally, whoever kills a believer by mistake, then the freeing of a believing slave and a compensation payment presented to the deceased family is required unless they give up their right as a charity. Okay. So what is the implied meaning? Okay. If you look at the implied meaning, we have two methods. We have superior analogy and equivalent analogy, right? Now, if you say, look, somebody who kills a believer by mistake has to free a slave. What about somebody who kills a believer intentionally?
Fall under the first verse.
Don't they need to also free a slave?
No.
So because we already discussed in the last class, that's true, and that's a good evidence for our people. But you want to understand the details, right? So the thing is, basically, look, imagine somebody comes and makes this argument. So you're telling me that if this guy who intentionally killed that person, right, he's going to get just the death penalty, but he doesn't need to have any financial compensation. He doesn't need to free a slave. And this guy accidentally did it, and he has to free a slave. Why shouldn't he have to free a slave too? Right? You can understand the question though, right? So if somebody comes along and says, look, well, it would only make sense, and you say, okay, how do you explain the position that you don't have to free a slave? You say, okay, what you just mentioned is the implied meaning of the text, because you're using a superior analogy. Somebody who kills intentionally is worse than somebody who killed accidentally. So by using the superior analogy, you're right, in the sense that this guy should also have to free a slave. However, the following verse says, whoever kills a believer intentionally, his recompense is hell, wherein he will abide eternally, and Allah has become angry with him and has cursed him and has prepared for a great punishment. And there's another verse about the killing, about retaliation in the killing. So the only verses that talk about intentional killing are those which are established by what kind of meaning? Explicit, alluded, or implied? Explicit. So the explicit one overrides the alluded meaning. And therefore, you stick with that. But there's been a difference of opinion on this issue. So the Hanafi school said that the explicit overrides the alluded meaning. The Shafi'i school says, no, we go ahead and we use superior analogy and we say that the person who commits intentional murder also has to free a slave. So they've taken this position, right? And they have their own way of looking at it. So what I want to emphasize here, right? And the Hanafi school is basically saying that, look, the sin of intentionally killing a person is so great. Some kafara, compensation or penalty is required for these small little sins. They're not for these major sins. This is the only thing you can get forgiven is by asking Allah for forgiveness. You can't. Freeing a slave is not going to help. You really need real, sincere forgiveness. The other one has to do with the guy made an accident. He didn't really mean to do it. They got into a fight and accidentally the guy slipped and he snapped his neck or something like that. This is accidental type of killing or unintentional killing. So, this is where you see the difference. So they say one of them says the alluded meaning takes precedence. The other one says that the other meaning takes precedence. Right? Well, actually, sorry. So you know what? My mistake. This was not an explicit meaning, right? In the text about going to hell and all of that, we said it's an alluded meaning. So there's an alluded meaning in that text that the Hanafi school is taking, and there's an implied meaning in the other text. So the Hanafi said the alluded meaning takes precedence over the implied meaning. Shafi'i school said vice versa. Do we see that? A little bit. You reflect upon it over break, and you'll see it, inshallah. Alright? So this is the thing I was talking about before. Do you go with the one that's in the text and a little bit rational, or do you go with the one that's more rational and implies the underlying spirit of the text? So that's really where the issue is.
So where do you find a belief in slaves to free nowadays?
So don't worry about that later, inshallah. There's a lot of slaves, trust me. We just don't have them. We don't have access to them, but there's a lot of slaves in the world. Alright, so we will stop inshallah here and we'll come back after Isha. Try to come back soon. After Isha, you can pray your sunnah afterwards. So don't spend too long. 2 minutes is okay, and then we'll come back inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يئوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي فمن يكفر بالطاغوت ويؤمن بالله فقد استمسك بالعروة الوثقى لا انفصام لها والله سميع عليم الله ولي الذين آمنوا يخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور والذين كفروا أولياءهم الطاغوت يخرجونهم من النور إلى الظلمات أولئك أصحاب النار هم فيها خالدون الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ألم تر إلى الذي حاج إبراهيم في ربه أن آتاه الله الملك إذ قال إبراهيم ربي الذي يحيي ويميت قال أنا أحيي وأميت قال إبراهيم فإن الله يأتي بالشمس من المشرق فأت بها من المغرب فبهت الذي كفر والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين أو كالذي مر على قرية وهي خاوية قال أنى يحيي هذه الله بعد موتها فأماته الله 100 عام ثم بعثه قال كم لبثت قال لبثت يوما أو بعض يوم قال بل لبثت 100 عام فانظر إلى طعامك وشرابك لم يتسنه وانظر إلى حمارك ولنجعلك آية للناس وانظر إلى العظام كيف ننشزها ثم نكسوها لحما فلما تبين له قال أعلم أن الله على كل شيء قدير. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
We're the only obedient ones.
Even though their sisters are going to the masjid, there's a little area over there. Brothers always go over there to pray instead of going in the masjid.
In the back?
Well, you know, like
Yeah, where they're praying here and then they're praying right here?
where the sisters go.
Oh, in the front. They must, that, because it's dark area. That's probably what. They want to be in a dark area.
It's so embarrassing.
I totally agree with it. It should just be secluded down. Can you do me a favor? Send me this via email.
Okay.
And I'm gonna talk to Sheikh Fakhi and say, I'm not gonna get it. Put a sign there or something on it.
I just
We'll figure out.
first of all, you know, looking for
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Just email it to me, inshallah. I'll follow up on it, inshallah. Okay. Who wants to do this?
Consolation, I was in a way always there.
I'm too.
We're talking about how you're condensing this class into.
Oh yeah, you were doing live streaming.
So,
Inshallah.
into one quarter.
Good. I'm glad you were there.
How this is the easiest class for you to prepare for the hardest for us to take.
It's easiest for me to prepare in the sense of thought going into what, but time-wise, it's not easy. It's one of the longest classes for me to prepare, but the thought involved is not that much for me anymore. Because there's only like 1 or 2 days to teach the class. You take the Life of the Prophet, for example, every single book that's been written has different material in it. So figuring out what to put and what not to put is very, very difficult.
I know history was the hardest.
Yeah, history was the hardest, the absolute hardest.
This is very clinical.
It's very technical things. All right, let's continue. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. So now we're going to talk about another type of meaning, which is known as the inverse meaning, or mafhum al-mukhalafa. So we've seen something known as mafhum al-muwafaqa. Right? Remember where we saw that? Guess not. We just saw it recently. What were we talking about? Which one? Explicit, implied, or alluded? The third one. So implied meaning. Mafhum al-muwafaqa is a similar meaning when we're talking about analogy and saying both to parents and all of that. That's known as mafhum al-muwafaqa. The opposite of mafhum al-muwafaqa is mafhum al-mukhalafa. So, understanding the opposite meaning. Okay, so what does this mean? The inverse meaning of a text is to affirm. Okay, it's to affirm that the opposite meaning is giving some type of meaning from what the text is actually saying. So it's making an argument from silence, for example. So let's take an example. The inverse meaning of the statement. If you tell somebody, you know what, you may delay your fasting if you're traveling. Now you tell someone you may delay your fasting if you're traveling. The opposite of that statement would be, you may not delay your fasting if you are not traveling. Right? So if I go and somebody asks me to say, you know what, so are we allowed to do this or do that? And I say, you know what, if you're traveling and it's difficult for you, then you may go ahead and delay your fasting in the month of Ramadan. You can make up the fast later. So someone comes along and says, you know what, I'm extremely sick. I'm really, really ill, and it's very difficult for me. But you know what? When I asked the teacher, he told me, you can delay your fast if you're traveling. That means you cannot delay your fast unless you're traveling. If you're not traveling, you can't delay even if you're sick. So the inverse understanding of that statement, by adding a bunch of knots in there, if you affirm it, then it may have a meaning. You're saying that what they didn't talk about, but the understanding is the opposite, is that this is known as mafhum al-mukhalafa, the inverse or the opposite meaning of what it is. Now in this case, is it a true or not true statement? Understanding the inverse meaning is correct or not correct?
No.
There may be other instances that you may delay your fasting.
Okay, so the wording itself is known as the mandub, what it's saying. Okay, this is, you may delay your fasting if you're traveling. Is that true or not true?
Yes.
Okay. You may not delay your fasting if you are not traveling. Is that true or false? You may not delay your fasting if you're not traveling. But if you're sick and you're at home and you're not traveling, can you delay your fasting? Yes, you can, right? So taking the inverse meaning of this is a wrong statement. It leads you to a wrong conclusion, right? Even though it looks like, hey, well, that makes sense to do the opposite, right? To assume the opposite would make sense, but it doesn't always make sense. Yeah, there is a verse, right? So we're gonna see that. We're gonna see that in show. So let's take a look at some of these things. So the Quran, the wording is explicit on the permissibility of delaying the fast, but it's silent about the inverse meaning. So the question is the inverse meaning telling you something or it's not telling you something? Right? So can we assume it? Can we assume that the person intended to tell you the opposite also?
No, we cannot.
So in some cases we can, and in some cases we can't. So let's take a look at the cases where we can. You actually can assume the opposite meaning. So let's take a look at a verse from the Quran. Allah says, say, I do not find within that which was revealed to me anything forbidden to one who would eat it, unless it be a dead animal, or blood spilled out, or the flesh of swine, and the rest of the verse goes on. Let's focus on the blood spilled out. So this verse says, I do not find anything forbidden except these things. So the blood spilled out is forbidden. Okay? Consuming blood, what is it forbidden? To smell it or to look at it? Yes. Good. Alright, so the inverse meaning would be blood which is not spilled out. Right? So what does blood spilled out mean? When you're slaughtering an animal, blood is going to spill out of the animal, right? It's going to gush out of the animal. Whatever blood remains inside the animal, right, according to the inverse understanding of this, would be that you're allowed to consume the blood that's remaining in the animal. So let's say you like your steak rare, right? Really rare. So it's like there's even some blood. You know, rare. Anyone like rare steak? No. You used to? Okay. Yeah, I don't, but maybe some people do. Some people like their steak rare. So you got some blood, right? And it's not been spilled out, it remained in the veins. Are you allowed to consume that steak with a little bit of blood that's there? Okay. According to the inverse meaning of this statement, or because we studied it in the previous class? Because we studied in the previous class. Good. Now we go back to the statement. We say, okay, the inverse understanding is, it said blood spilled out is prohibited for you. So can you safely assume that blood not spilled out is not prohibited for you? By principle or in this context? In this context. No. You maybe say by principle. In this context, it's a correct understanding. It's correct. So blood that has not been spilled out and has remained in the veins, and you chop up the animal and you take some piece of it, blood that's still inside, you're allowed to consume that because it's part of the meat. You don't drink it, but I mean, if it's part of the meat, it's kind of cooked in there, you got some blood in your pot. Are you allowed to consume that? Yes, you are. When you buy certain types of meat cuts, right, there's sometimes blood in the bag. You take that whole thing and you put it in the pot and you start cooking it. The blood has been cooked into the meat. It didn't, let's assume it didn't all evaporate, it didn't change into a different substance or whatever. It's there in the meat. Are you allowed to consume that blood? According to inverse understanding, you are. And in this case, inverse understanding is the correct ruling. So it doesn't establish the principle, but it shows you that there's no problem in doing the inverse understanding here.
But there can be an inference from that if you slaughter the animal, you don't need to let the blood drain out. And if the blood remains in the animal, then you can consume it.
No, but that would go against the explicit meaning of slaughtering an animal, which is a hadith.
Okay.
So there's always a way to figure that out. So that's one. Okay. The next example, it says, and if he has divorced her, meaning for the third time, then she's not lawful to him afterwards until she marries a husband other than him. So if you divorce somebody 3 times, you cannot marry that person again until they've married somebody else first. Marriage didn't work out, they divorced, and now you can go ahead and remarry the same person again, the new marriage contract. So the inverse meaning would be that she is lawful to him for marriage after she's married another person. Right? Because it's saying she's not lawful until. It's saying once she has married someone else, then she is lawful. Is this inverse meaning correct?
No.
It's not correct.
Well, you can't be married to 2 people are lawful to somebody while you're married to somebody else.
After they separate.
Separated as in divorce?
Yeah, divorce. Not just separate as in divorce.
Yeah, then
You can't, right? So this is allowed. So the inverse understanding is correct. It's correct, right? Next example. And give 2 women upon their marriage their bridal gifts graciously. Give them their dowry. But if they give it up willingly, if they give up their dowry willingly to you anything of it, then take it in satisfaction and ease. Maybe if they say, you know what, I don't want, I'm willing to give you 10,000, and then afterwards they say, we agreed on 10,000, I only want 5,000. I'm very happy with this other ring that you bought me and everything, I don't need the rest. Okay. Take it, you can have it. Right? So many of the men will be, this is a great verse, this is awesome. Why would you not take it? Great deal. So the thing is, the inverse meaning would be what? If they don't give up their dowry willingly, then you're not allowed to take it from them. Correct meaning? Correct meaning. Inverse meaning applies well. Next verse. And those who accuse chaste women and do not produce 4 witnesses, lash them with 80 lashes and do not accept from them testimony ever after. And those are the defiantly disobedient people. So you're going to accuse women of adultery or making rumors about them, you get 80 lashes. The inverse meaning would be what? They get nothing but 80 lashes. There's no, I'm sorry, it's not going to cut it. You don't give them 50 lashes because they did, they apologized nicely. You don't go above and give them 100 lashes because they said it in a very bad way. It's 80. It's not above 80. It's not less than 80. It's exactly 80. Inverse meaning applies in terms of numbers. The number means the number. It says fast 3 days. It means 3 days. It cannot be 4. It cannot be 2. 3 means 3. So that's inverse meaning means anything other than 3 would not be acceptable. And that's correct. So it applies in these scenarios. Now in the next following scenarios, it doesn't apply. And it becomes problematic. So let's look at some of the problems. So verse says, the number of months in the sight of God is 12. 12 months. as determined and decreed by God on the day when He created the heavens and the earth. 4 of them, of the months, are sacred. Right? And in that context, fighting is not allowed. So then it continues and it says, do not therefore wrong yourselves, meaning do not oppress during this time. Okay? Now, what is the inverse meaning of this text? If 4 months are sacred in this time, in this way, that means that there are no other sacred months. Is Ramadan one of the 4 months mentioned in the verse? It's not. Is Ramadan considered a sacred month? In a sense, yes. Right? But not in the same sense. So does it mean to exclude Ramadan? No. Then it says, you know what, and do not oppress or wrong yourselves in these months. So does that mean outside of these months you can oppress people and you can wrong yourself? No, right? So you can't apply the inverse meaning. Otherwise, you know what? I'm going to go and oppress people outside the other months. No, but you can't do that either. Right? So this will lead to a problematic understanding. The next example is the verse, part of the verse says, Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. So the inverse meaning would be what? Anyone other than Muhammad is not the messenger of Allah. Are there any other messengers of Allah? Of course there are, right? So using a name, you can't use this at all for inverse understanding. You would have a major problem, right? If you try to understand things this way. Next verse. Your Lord has decreed that you worship none but Him alone, and treat parents with the best of kindness. Should one of them or both of them attain old age in your lifetime, do not say oof to them. So the inverse meaning is that you can use any other words besides oof, like we talked about in the implied meaning. So obviously, it can't be the inverse understanding. The next one is prohibited to you for marriage, or your mothers, etc., your stepdaughters. Specifically, it says stepdaughters under your guardianship. Okay? What is a stepdaughter under your guardianship? It means, what is a stepdaughter, first of all? Child from another marriage, exactly. So it's not your child, but you married the person who has that child coming into the marriage. So it says that prohibited to you for marriage are your stepdaughters under your guardianship, means the ones that are living with you, the ones that are living in your house. Okay. So the inverse meaning of this would be you're allowed to marry stepdaughters or stepsons who are not under your guardianship and they're not living with you. Accepted or not accepted? It's not. It wouldn't make sense even, right? So it's not accepted. So they say, what's the point of mentioning the attribute of guardianship and living together? Why was it mentioned? Because we looked at the other example about blood, right? So the blood spilled forth. Blood that's not been spilled forth, we said, by mafhum al-mukhalafa, inverse understanding, it's allowed. In that case, there's no problem. In this case, it says stepdaughters under your guardianship. So both of them are what? They're descriptions. There's description of stepdaughter, she's living with you. Description of blood, it's been spilled out. So in this description, if you understood, you took away the description, there's no problem. In this one, to take away the description, there's a big problem. You still can't marry your stepdaughter, whether she's living with you or she's not living with you. So this leads to a problem. So why was it mentioned? Now, so just understand that it's a problem. The reason why it wasn't mentioned is because it's customary for stepchildren to live with their parents, obviously. Right? It's very customary for them to live together. So the Quran was mentioning this attribute as a custom of describing specifically in more detail what generally happens. Not mentioning it in a legal sense that this is conditional to your not marrying them. Whereas in the blood, it's more of a conditional thing. See the difference between the two of them? There's a difference, right? So it's a very subtle difference, right? And then you look at the next example. O you who have believed, prescribed for you is legal retribution for those who have been murdered. The free for the free, the slave for the slave, and the female for the female. So what would the inverse meaning of this verse potentially be? Well, it says female for female. So if a man murders a woman, he is not going to get retaliated against because it's female for female and this is male for female. Therefore, retaliation will not apply. Right? So if a guy kills a woman or vice versa, it's not going to apply retaliation. The person is not going to get killed. But you can't assume that, you can't posit that as an affirmative statement because there's a problem here. Now, the other problem is this is contradicted by another text. Another verse in the Quran says, and we ordain for them a life for a life. And life for a life is general. So it specifies now that the intended meaning of that was to show type of equality to an unjust situation which was taking place in the past. You have to know the context of the verse. Here, life for life means life for life. It doesn't matter if the person is male or female, free or slave. The retaliation is going to go up, either way. It's going to be equal across the board. So it's important to understand that. The next one, two more, and then we're done on the examples. When you travel through the land, there is no blame upon you for shortening the prayer. If you fear, remove the especially part. Where did the verse go? Oh, it's not on there. Okay. Listen to the verse very carefully. This is an example of how you lose some if you're not reading. Right? And when you travel throughout the land, there's no blame upon you for shortening the prayer. You can shorten your prayer from 3 units to 2.
From 4 to 2.
Oh, 4 to 2. Okay. So you can shorten from 4 to 2. So there's no blame on you for shortening the prayer. Now listen to this. If you fear that those who disbelieve may disrupt or attack you. So the inverse meaning of this verse is, if there's no fear that someone is going to disrupt or attack you, you're not allowed to shorten your prayers. Do we take the inverse meaning or no? We don't, because this has been clearly overridden by the example of the Prophet as well as his clear, explicit statements that you're allowed to do it even if there's no fear. Right? So it's not a limiting factor of fear. So the fear part was incidental to the context or to the verse being mentioned. Just like the same example of stepdaughter not living with you. We took that example, right? Or living with you, and then you take it opposite. So you can't apply the opposite here in this case. Last one, and this is kind of a funny one. No one, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, no one should urinate in standing water, still water, and then take a bath from it, make ghusl from it. Now, hopefully no one has tried this before. Hopefully no one will consider this. But what is the inverse meaning? The inverse meaning could be that, it's fine to urinate in standing water and do something else like make wudu from it. Because it didn't say, it didn't mention specifically. Or it's fine for you to urinate into flowing water. Right? So if it's kind of moving a little bit, you can go and urinate and you can make wudu because it said specifically standing water. Right? Or one interesting clever guy came up with this idea. He said, if you urinate into a cup, or let's say a jug, okay, and then you pour the urine into the water, then you're allowed to take a bath because you didn't urinate directly into the water. Now, obviously this is problematic. You wouldn't want to do this, right? So this is where you see that positing the inverse meaning of an Islamic text can actually be very dangerous, and it can lead to a lot of problems. Okay? Even if we put a lot of conditions there, sometimes it can work this way, sometimes it can work the opposite way. However, if you're writing a legal document, you're making a business contract with somebody else, or you're writing an inheritance, or you're writing a will or something, you can use mafhum al-mukhalafa, you can use the inverse meaning as a proof, affirming what wasn't mentioned there. And the reason why you shouldn't do it in Islamic text and you're allowed to do it in contracts, does anyone know? Can anyone think of the reason? We said something about lawyers and computer scientists. It's coming back to that. It's because people who write contracts use that language really strictly, not the way we casually use human language, and contracts are closed-ended. In the sense that you're writing a contract, everything that you are thinking of, you're going to put in that contract. If you didn't put it in the contract, it's gonna, there's not another contract that explains something else somewhere, right? Or if you had in your mind something else, that's your problem. You forgot to put it in the contract, you forgot to put it in the contract. You forgot to specify the dowry, hey, you're going to have to pay whatever or receive whatever is customary. So contracts have all your thoughts in there, whatever you wanted to apply. So if there's a contract, for example, where you're writing your inheritance, and you say, I'm leaving $1,000 to Muhammad and to Aisha, okay? And you're saying, and $300 will go to Muhammad. Can you assume for sure that $700 is going to Aisha in a contract?
Unless there's anything else.
Unless there's nothing else in the contract. You can. You can. Because there's no other contract. The contract is closed-ended. That's it. This is the contract that says everything. When it comes to Quran, when it comes to Hadith and all of that, you can't do that. Right? You can't do that explicitly. So this is the issue. So now here's the thing. So normal human language has some ambiguity built into it, and this is a problem when it comes to understanding certain things. So for example, if somebody says, you know what, if Brother Azizan, if he asks you for help tomorrow morning, I want you to help him. So I tell Manzoor, Brother Azizan asks you tomorrow morning, he needs some help him. So then all of a sudden Brother Azizan comes to you tomorrow evening, and he asks you, so I'm not going to help him. He said tomorrow morning, only tomorrow morning. Can you assume that in human language? You can't assume. That's the wrong with this, because it's not a right understanding, right? So you can't do that. If somebody says, you know what, I saw Muhammad, does that mean that he saw nobody else but Muhammad is the only person that he saw? No, it doesn't exclude that, right? So we use language loosely and we use it open-endedly. We don't close it. It's not closed-ended. It's not a closed, what do you call it? Like a closed system. Whereas in a contract, you can do that. So that's why you have to be careful. So if we say that it's dangerous to use inverse meaning, then what do we do in cases where it does apply? Like, for example, the text which says, blood spilled forth is prohibited for you. So the blood that's been spilled out of the animal is prohibited for you. So what do you do? If you assume and you say you cannot take the inverse meaning, so then are you allowed to eat the blood that's not, drink the blood or something that's not been spilled out of the animal, that's remained inside mixed with the meat? Not drinking, but if it's mixed with the meat or something, are you allowed to consume it? Okay, what's the proof besides what the last class told us of? Okay, but if we say that we are not going to apply, we're not going to allow the inverse meaning to be an affirmative proposition for us. How do we prove that we're allowed to have the meat with some blood in it? It's too difficult? It's harder? Okay, but do you have to try your best, like squeeze it out and everything? Okay, you don't have to try even. So, what's the better proof? We actually studied it already. I'll give you a hint. We studied it in a section called Ishab, presumption of continuity. Anyone remember? There's one other way to apply Ishab. What is it?
It doesn't say that directly it's prohibited.
Exactly. If it doesn't say that it's directly prohibited, it's okay for you. So there's nowhere that specifically said that you can't consume this type of blood. Therefore, you can go ahead and say, okay, well, it's going to be generally allowed for us. Okay. So there's a way that you don't need to use the inverse understanding because everything is allowed by default. Right? That's the general proposition. Right? So you leave it open. There are several texts, and in addition to that, there are several texts which actually state the inverse meaning without you having to infer it. So let's take an example. Prohibited to you for marriage are, etc., etc., etc. Your stepdaughters under your guardianship born of your wives unto whom you have gone in, meaning you've had intercourse with them. Right? But if you have not gone in unto them, then there is no sin upon you. So what is the inverse meaning of the first statement? It's right there. If you've not had intercourse with them, then there's no sin on you. So here's the thing. Allah mentioned specifically, explicitly, the inverse meaning of the previous sentence. So if the inverse meaning is supposed to be inferred for you, and you automatically are supposed to think of it, why would he mention it again? That's redundant, and there's no need to mention it a second time. Which means, the fact that he mentioned it the second time means the principle of taking the inverse understanding should not be a principle that we act upon. Does that make sense? One more? Okay. I know it's getting late, but even the computer's tired now. Right? So almost done. This is the last one. So then it says, and they ask you about menstruation. Say, it is harm. So keep away from women during menstruation. Okay. So, and do not approach them until they are pure. Okay. So now, what is the inverse understanding of do not approach them until they are pure?
When they're pure, you can approach them.
When you're pure, you can approach them, right? And that's exactly what the Quran says. And when they have purified themselves, then approach them. So the inverse meaning has been stated explicitly in words by Allah. So you didn't have to actually come through with it, right? So the fact that it's there kind of gives you something to think about, okay, in terms of this. So this is inverse meaning and all of that. There's some really good questions from online students. Let me answer these, and then I'll take your questions. What if someone cannot afford the amount for dowry as demanded? Okay. Then it becomes a debt on them. It's a loan. They have to pay it off over time. Why is the verse about murderers of Muslims going to hell an alluded meaning and not an explicit meaning? It's a good question. So that verse that we said, them going to hell is an explicit meaning. Their only punishment being going to hell and not any other punishment is an alluded meaning. So there's a difference between the two things. And that's it. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
The words the free for free and slave for a slave, I don't understand why it says that.
Why does it say that?
Female for female or
Okay, so we can't get into the details of why it says it, but I'll give you the general meaning. It's saying there's equality across the board because people used to think that you cannot retaliate one type of person against another type of person. And it says everything's equal. You know what they say, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, nose for a nose, same thing. So it's saying, you know what, free for free is women for women, slave for slave, meaning everything is equal. It doesn't mean that you can't retaliate one for the other. So it's a general statement that means that everything should be equal across the board, right? So right, it's not looking at and man for slave and free for slave and this way or that way. So that it's in response to a specific context in which it was asked.
I think it's also implied that if you kill a slave, the other person came and said, no, you kill the master, you know, instead of killing a slave. For
yeah, that is also important. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Going back to the beginning, and if you hear or don't send it back to it,
so this is the mafhum al-mukhalafa, right? So if you fear that you cannot be just with the orphan girls, right, then you start marrying the other ones. So if you apply the inverse meaning, and if you do not fear that you cannot, meaning you can be just with orphan girls, does that mean you're not allowed to marry non-orphan girls? Because that would be the inverse meaning. So you can't assume the inverse meaning. Otherwise, you got no choice but to marry the orphan girls first, unless you're scared of, you know, dealing justly with them. So the inverse meaning doesn't apply in this context because we said it's not a good method to be using. Does that make sense?
yeah, just a quick question, but the fact that it was mentioned first, does that mean that it's preferred?
Meaning that's a primary meaning?
Meaning that.
Oh, meaning that it's preferred to marry the orphan girl? It depends on the context. It really depends on the context. So just because it came first doesn't necessarily mean that it's more important or it's preferred. But it's the wording that will dictate whether it is or it's not, and the general context of other verses regarding it.
Because it would make sense if it said, if you can't treat them justly, then marry them. But if it would be meant to imply that if you can't be just with them, then go marry somebody, that would not make sense. Why would you marry somebody if you can't treat an orphan girl justly?
Because the temptation of marrying an orphan girl because she's in a position of weakness is greater. It's more dangerous for you to marry someone like that, right? Because there's more temptation involved. That's the reason behind it. Let me give you a simple analogy. So, if someone were to tell you, you know what, you're going to go and you're going to marry someone who doesn't have a visa. They're not legal in this country and you're going to marry them. If you can't deal justly with them, then make sure you marry someone who's legal in this country. Why? Because you have the upper hand when someone doesn't have a visa and they're illegal in this country. You can go, I'm going to report you, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You better deal justly with them. And if you can't, and you're scared you can abuse your authority, your power, whatever upper hand you have, then don't marry them, go marry someone who has citizenship status. Make sense? Yeah.
About the intention for fasting or salah is like we have to do our intention with and make fast. Like isn't it like waking up for support or like making wudu the action we like to place the intention?
That is the Hanafi position. But not all the other schools. Some say you specifically have to make it. Yeah.
Like in Ramadan, just one time in the beginning of Ramadan, but every night
this is the difference of opinion. So according to the Hanafi school, one time in Ramadan, because it's Ramadan, you're going to have the intention for the whole month. In other schools, every single day, you have to make an individual intention. And if you didn't have it, if you slept through it,
Actually,
like waking up for support, that's
no. So intention doesn't mean you have to say it per se. Okay? But if for some reason you forgot and you weren't thinking about it, and all of a sudden you wake up and you think, oh, I'm going to eat because I'm not fasting. And then all of a sudden you remember, oh no, I'm fasting. You didn't have the intention from the beginning. So the intention has to be there from the beginning. Or let's say you intended, you know what, I'm feeling sick. I'm not going to fast. All right? And then all of a sudden you wake up in the morning and you wake up after Fajr. What happens now? You didn't have the intention. You had the intention to not fast. While you were sleeping, you didn't make a new intention in your mind. So what happens to you in this scenario? That's what intention. Intention doesn't mean like, I am intending to fast. It's not the verbal intention. It's in the heart intention.
It's not practically every night.
Yes.
Every night you have to.
You need the intention.
But that's why we go to the marriage.
Mm.
At the beginning of Ramadan, before, one time, we say it for the whole month.
Mashallah. That's very good. So you run with the other man.
That's what we do.
Everyone in your group does that? Mashallah.
I think the Hanafi school follows the same
It does.
procedure because we are supposed to, and we actually say it loud when we do the suhoor, you know, the niyyah for some.
That's not actually from the Hanafi.
But we do it in
the desis are like a mixed salad, a hybrid of a bunch of things. Some culture here, some this madhab there, some random thing here, something that has nothing to do with Islam here. It's through everything in the Hindu culture and everything mixed together. So they're very diverse hybrid.
Because one of the things that I remember being prevalent is the fact that if you forget to wake up, you're allowed to make niyyah before Dhuhr. And if
We'll leave this issue. The goal to remember is now that you've taken this class, right? There are ways of proving things in Islamic law. And the fact that we do it this way in this country or something is not a proof in and of itself. Just keep that in mind.
So which one are you supposed to do, once in Ramadan or every day?
You take the Islamic law one class and you get the answer. Yes.
Ramadan, you have to, you don't have to have the attention at the night. Even you wake up like our Prophet,
yes.
he doesn't have any
Yes.
in his house, then he will take the class.
And we cover that in the class too.
But only in Ramadan, it's better to
Yes.
before Ramadan.
some people have the intention to fast every Monday and Thursday, like they follow the Prophet. as sunnah. And like they don't make intention every night.
Yeah, because
Just like do it without-
there's a difference between the mandatory fast and the optional fast.
Actually, you have to make them, you know.
No, other way around.
Yeah.
Other way around.
The optional, you
The
do-
optional, you don't have to make the niyya.
Okay, and the Ramadan will-
You have to. Okay, last question.
Back to the point about the orphans. Yeah, the main topic I think is, like you said, you want to be fair to them and whatnot. But I think the main ruling, reason for that ruling is in many societies, orphans are extremely taken advantage of. There's a point where they're not even allowed to have a name. They're not allowed to inherit. They're not allowed to. There's no basic rights for orphans. They're not allowed to get married. They're not allowed to have housing as well. And that was in a lot of societies before Islam.
Alhamdulillah.
Protection.
Alhamdulillah. طيب سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك اللهم ونتوب إليك السلام عليكم.
During Ramadan, we get up and do it out of
Yeah.
the.
Yeah. I get that clicker.
So, are orphans considered to be